Well, hello again, and welcome to another episode of Sermon B-Sides. My name is Rusten. I'm one of the pastors at Cormdale Church, and I'm here with my buddy, my pal, Pastor Jon. What's up, Pastor Jon?
Hey, I just had a weekend off. I was up in Port Angeles enjoying the sun, and so I'm more refreshed this Monday morning than I typically am, which is good.
Nice. What was the weather like in Port Angeles?
Well, strangely enough, on our way there, my brother was there ahead of us, and it was pouring down rain. By the time we got there, it was just kind of sprinkling. That was Thursday afternoon. And then from that point on, it was just like 58, 62, sunny. That's perfect.
It definitely has transitioned to fall. Like, even it's sunny today, but it is fall.
For sure. Yeah, it's definitely cooler outside. I've been watching the weather app, and I'm like, I want that temperature to get as close to 32 as possible. Because then it means it could snow.
Yes, totally.
And it's supposed to be a snowy, cold year, right? So
yeah, that's what I heard. I heard it's going to be a chilly. In fact, I spent Saturday stacking wood most of the day, and when I was preaching on Sunday, my wrist was like even just touching the podium, I was like, man, my wrist is so sore. You know that feeling when you pick up the wood like that, like over and over and over again, like this weird muscle in your wrist, it gets sore. Yeah. So we're back in Exodus. It's the last chapter of what's called the Law of the Covenant. Yeah, and it kind of runs through, kind of follows up some of the laws that were in the previous chapter, and then it gets into laws about feasts and laws about land and how the people, what certain principles and revelations about what the people can expect as they enter into the land of Canaan. So you preached this one last week, and I remember you opened up the sermon by talking about false witness, right? Yeah, and how sometimes, because I think the section, your 3 points were like law, like was it laws about
it was the courts,
speech, and then like law, the courts. That's right.
Yeah, the courts, calendar, and the land,
and the. Okay, cool. Yeah, so courts, calendar, and the land. So can you talk? There's an interesting thing you brought up in dealing with the courts and dealing with false witness. The command, the ninth commandment, doesn't merely address not lying. It has a specific language that's used is about bearing false witness, which has a courtroom context. Can you talk a little bit about why that's important?
Yeah, it doesn't mean that lying is unimportant, but there is a particular thing that the ninth commandment has in mind, and that is not simply like deceiving your neighbor by lying about how much money you have. It is turning justice against the innocent, which is a more significant offense than simply, lying about whatever fact of your life. When you bear false witness, you take a system, you take justice, which is meant to punish evil and reward good and protect the innocent and make sure that those who are guilty pay the just penalty for their offense. It takes that entire system and it turns it upside down. So justice no longer is about who's innocent and who's guilty. Justice becomes a matter of who's in and who's out. And when that happens, that's the kind of lie that affects more than just one person who's telling the lie or the person who the lie is being told to. That's the kind of thing that corrupts justice for an entire nation. So the root system goes down and deep and far and wide. And when that happens, you have no justice for anybody.
Yeah, and it's kind of like an application of what you had mentioned earlier in the previous sermon, which is about, I think it's the previous sermon about the goat in the mother's milk, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's perverting something that's meant for good. And I think that's interesting because there's an interesting tie here being made between uh, false accusation or lies in this
Mm-hmm.
in the court space, you might even say lies in the political space,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And partiality.
Yep.
And I find that those two things tied together here very interesting, because it seems to be that when you have like thinking, we can either look at our current day situation, or we can look at, like, the situation that Solzhenitsyn lived under,
Mm-hmm.
right? You
Mm-hmm.
had an entire justice system that was given over to partiality, right? Justice wasn't about, blind justice, rule of the law, everybody's responsible for their actions. It became, are you in the party or are you out?
Right.
Because if you're unfaithful to the party, that's all that matters, and we are going to use every bit of force we have to persecute you,
Yeah.
right? But at the
Yeah.
same time, when you have that kind of system, it seems like those places, those governments, those nations that have fallen to this also are just living on lies
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
and blatant falsities. And I feel like we're kind of in both those things are rampant today in our culture, and so it doesn't bode well.
Yeah. What I was
Do you want to? I was gonna say,
yeah,
do you want to talk about like how we see this today?
sure. While I was preaching it, the reason we do this is because there's things you can't talk about in a sermon because of time. So sometimes
Yeah,
you make like passing comments, or you're kind of like banking on people kind of can read between the lines. But what goes through my head is, if you burn down a city, you're protected. But if you pray outside of an abortion center, you go to prison. Right? That When that is what the courts hand down, it makes it obvious to anybody who wants to see it that the rulings, the verdicts, the punishments have nothing to do with what you've done or haven't done. It's all about what group you belong to. And
yeah,
that's just one gross, obvious example of how that works out. Right now, a lot of it is political. If you belong to one political party, you kind of get a free pass on everything you do. Or if you belong to one particular class of victims, you get a free pass. But if you don't belong to that class of victims, then you will be not held to an equal standard, but held to a completely different standard that and many times seems arbitrary. And that just seems
yeah,
like that's the norm, right? It's like
yep,
nobody's surprised by that anymore.
and it's very much, that's we've talked in the past a lot about CRT and
Yeah.
intersectionality and stuff like that. But I believe CRT was like initially popularized in our political space because it was understood to be a good legal theory, have a good applications for justice and how
Mm.
you understood uh, like how justice would be meted out for people, which is highly concerning because it's basically the operating principle is denying that what we read in this passage, which is you should not show partiality to the poor,
Yeah.
right?
Correct.
Like
Yes.
there's a principle, here, and you did touch on that in the sermon. Maybe you can unpack that a little bit more. Why that's controversial and why it's
Yeah.
crucial.
Yeah. It specifically talks about not being partial to the poor person. And, we I think we tend to think that partiality would be shown to the person who has wealth, or the person who has status, or the person who has power, because there's obviously a kickback, right? So if you're partial to the person with influence, that influence is going to work its way towards you. If you're partial to the person with lots of wealth, somehow that wealth is going to work its way back to you. So you can kind of understand the motive for that. But the text also forbids showing partiality to a poor person because they are poor, which
Mm-hmm.
means that a poor person doesn't get off the hook for what they've done simply because they're poor or because they belong to a group of people who have, less income than however you would break that down. Um, and that's motivated by something different. Can be motivated by self-righteousness. It can be motivated by, wanting to signal that you're a virtuous person, that you're compassionate, that you actually care about people that you don't actually care about. There's all sorts of demented aspirations for that.
Yeah.
But that, this is the way that justice works, is that it works in both directions. It doesn't just work
Yep.
for one group. It works for all groups. So whether you're showing partiality to somebody because of what they have, or you're showing it to somebody because of what they don't have, both instances are forbidden. Because in both cases it perverts justice. And what happens when you pervert justice is it has a way of taking people's trust and their hope away, because they know no matter what happens, a certain group is always going to win, right? You're not playing, with same rules on both sides. And so it's interesting in the text when you read the first 9 verses, and almost, right, you catch yourself thinking that the topic is going from partiality in the courts, and then he talks about your enemies, ox and donkey, and then it goes back to the courts. And it seems like, why is that thing in the middle with the ox and donkey? Like, what does it have to do with it? And I think the point is that partiality has to be practiced or being impartial has to be practiced in every sphere of life. Like when it comes to testifying in a court, you have to be impartial, but you also have to be impartial in the ordinary day-to-day thing. So if your enemy needs help with their ox, you should help them, because that's the loving thing to do for your neighbor, regardless of what group your neighbor belongs to, right? Like those small day-to-day things are like the workout and the preparation for the matters that may be more consequential and weighty, and that being, a case being prosecuted in court in which your testimony is going to have a massive impact on somebody's future.
Yeah, there's a kind of like, it's kind of like almost acknowledging the grassrootsiness of how justice systems can be perverted, right?
Yeah.
Like if your people aren't a people of impartiality, then why would you expect the government where the laws are written to be impartial?
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
There's and I think the reason why all this impartiality is also so crucial is that it's really rooted in the fact that God's impartial.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. God is impartial when it comes to, there's an old phrase. I think it's like, he's no respecter of persons.
Yeah.
Right? He doesn't look at you and say, oh, you came from this background, or that, you're more favored by me because of that. No, it's like God holds everybody accountable to the same law. This came up when we looked at the Passover plague, right? When the plague was basically, from the son of Pharaoh all the way down to the slave girl working at the mill. This plague will come upon everybody, and the only thing that really matters is not what you've done, not who you are, not how victimized you are, not how rich you are, but do you have blood on the lintels?
Right.
That's the only thing that matters.
Exactly.
And so, I think that today and examples of the past really show us how wise God is in this passage, and also how we are just headed towards bad news if we continue down this path, because the impartiality has become the norm. Or partiality has become the norm. It's become the norm among the people and among like the way that legislation is litigated or whatever, like how it's actually brought to be in courts. You have with that the like just clear lawfare stuff that has been more and more common today, where you have very particularized. No, I think about the David Dilaudid situation. Do you remember when Kamala Harris, I think, was I don't know if she was an attorney general or she was like a prosecuting attorney for the some city, maybe San Francisco. I don't know. She weaponized the legal system to go after David Dilaudid. She in a state where there is so many secret hidden camera TV shows done all the time. She prosecuted him on a law that has never been prosecuted on in the history of the state, right? And that shows that the law is being impartially applied, right? Like,
was he the pro-life guy who was recording people, conversations, and selling baby parts?
Yeah, I should have probably given a little bit of. Yes, I probably should have given a little more background. Yeah, David Dilaudid had a secret camera, and he went and interviewed people at Planned Parenthood where they revealed that they were selling baby parts. Yeah. And then Kamala Harris weaponizes the law, like, to go after him for the secret camera stuff, not caring about what he exposed. It was the fact. It was the fact that he had used this hidden camera that was the issue, even though like that the hidden camera law had never seen any prosecution. She sent like I don't know if it was the police or whatever to like raid his house and take all his computers. It's like that's an example of partiality in the law when it's being applied. Yeah. Like when you see laws that are not being what's the word I'm thinking of, when you're not actually prosecuting anybody for breaking this law, but then you pick one instance, and it's so clearly politically motivated and
and it happens to be your political opponent.
Yes.
It's like, what are the chances? Well, you should take her word. Her values have not changed.
Yeah. So that, and I think that there is an interesting link with lies also, like a culture that has given itself over to partiality in this way really can only sustain it through lies over time. And it does feel like we're in that situation right now. It's just like blatant lies all the time from our political people.
Yeah. And I think it's like one example of this, which I didn't say on Sunday, or 2 Sundays ago, would be this. Like when my boys were in middle school, I would tell them about like protecting people. Like if somebody's getting bullied, you need to protect that person who's getting bullied. We were also very clear about like the whole LGBTQ stuff that was going on, that's not good. That's not God's plan. That there's no real happiness in that. And we had very specific conversations that if someone like a classmate, I don't even know what it means for a middle schooler to identify as whatever. I think it's like, it's some weird thing, but nevertheless, if they said, yeah, I'm this or that, and they were getting bullied for it, like it was their job to defend that person from being bullied, right? They weren't supposed to be okay with the people who disagree with them being bullied. It's like, you need to protect people from being bullied. And it doesn't matter the person who's getting picked on, like what their personal beliefs are. Yeah. You're not taking that into account because the right thing to do is to protect somebody from a bully. Right. And so they are to be impartial in that. That's a very simple, like day-to-day application of this law, which is really, again, mostly geared at the courts, but it needs to be, it needs to be part of the fabric of a culture. It's the way that people think. It's the way that people see one another, that we are going to do the right thing. We're going to love our neighbor. We're going to do good, regardless of who it is that we're doing it to.
Yep. It's crucial.
Yeah.
It's crucial to teach those things to your kids. So
yeah, and it can be confusing because you're like, wait, they're not on our side. I'm like, well, it doesn't matter. if they're not on our side.
Yeah.
Like, the right thing to do is the right thing to do.
Yes. Yes.
So
So moving on from the partiality and bearing, not bearing false witness. The other part of this chapter is like a bunch of laws about the Sabbath
yeah,
and festivals,
yeah,
right?
yep,
And just on its face, it's like really, you know, even though I think you talked about these festivals are not, they were for the old covenant and how they were pointing towards something to come. It's like on its face, you can still see like, wow, God cares about festivals,
yeah,
right? He
yep,
cares about rest. He cares about celebrating, like events that have happened in the past.
mm-hmm.
And I thought maybe it'd be fun to talk about. There's the principle, and then there's the application, and the application is unique for the old covenant people. But maybe we could talk a little bit about what is God's design in having these festivals.
Yeah. Well, I think the foundation of it goes back to Genesis. When God creates, he creates and he establishes a pattern that we're supposed to mimic, which is you work for 6 days and you rest for 7. So you have the
Yeah.
principle of rest being part of what we're created for. It's part of in Genesis 1, you have no sin, you have no death. In a perfect world, we're still called to rest, right? Even though we
Yeah.
don't have decay, excuse me, we're still called to rest, and God models that rest for us. So when you have the giving of the law in Exodus 20, you have that commandment about remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. 6 days you shall work, the 7th day you rest. That is an impartial law. It's given to everybody in your household. Even the animals get a day off. And so you have this principle of rest is really important to God because it's something that he puts into his law. When he has those 10, the 10 commandments, one of them is about rest. And so rest has to be important to God. It has to be important to us, just like murder, lying, adultery, stealing destroys self and destroys a people. So does not resting. That will also destroy a people. And so you have that basic principle. But in Exodus 23, that a principle is then applied more broadly, that God doesn't just want times of rest throughout the week, but he also wants times of rest throughout the year. And part of that rest, as in the celebration of the Passover, and what is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So you had the days leading up to Passover. God wants both rest and he also wants memory. He wants his people to recall his faithfulness to them, to hear their cry, to deliver them from Egypt, which actually was God giving them rest because they were slaves in Egypt. And so God has rescued them out of that. And so not only do they have a time to rest, but they have a time to remember that God is the one who gives them their rest. So you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a week that then led up to Passover. Then you have times of rest that are woven into the natural seasons and cycles of harvest. So you've got the first fruits, which is obviously when you've got the first fruits coming in from harvest that you are to celebrate. And that's also remembering that God is the one who brings the increase. Mm-hmm. He's the one that blesses the land and the crops so that they're fruitful, that families can eat. And then at the very end of the season, when it's all done, right, which then also leads into a season of rest, you have another feast, another time of looking back at what God had provided throughout the whole season, all the ways that he had shown up. And you have these feasts. And so you see both, celebrating, eating good food, being with family, sleeping in, resting. These are all things that God really cares about. And he cares about them enough not to suggest them, but to command them, right? He doesn't say, hey, think about feasting. He's like, you will feast. You will feast.
Yes. I think there's you bring up the kind of like the memory part of it. And I think that this idea of having, holidays or feasts, I love that also it's not just a holiday, it's like a feast week. It's like these weeks that come into hit your calendar, and you're just like, okay, this is the week we take the entire week off and we feast literally for an entire week. And that kind of like liturgy of a people embeds the meaning of that feast into them, right? It's a kind of it's kind of a way where if a way of discipleship that like it's super embodied, and it's tactile, and it's, because you're eating and time changes, like that time of the feast is like everything just changes because we're remembering and we're celebrating, and it's like you're bringing forward something that happened in the past as though it's happening again, and the joy of it. And that it's funny because when you read about that in the Old Testament, these feasts, you think, okay, so there are some kind of like, intense Reformed types who are like, so what's the word I'm thinking? They're so regulative principle, right?
Yeah.
They go, okay, so these like they'll quote the passage where it says, have no one judge you according to feast or new moon, and they go, okay, so these are over, but also we shouldn't have anything like this now. And I'm like, I think that actually, part of where the church is now is like, we're not regulated by the old covenants directives and commands with regard to feasting, but it's absolutely, I think we could look back and go, there's wisdom and joy in saying, hey, we're going to celebrate and remember things that have happened in the past, and we're going to do that by having it imposed upon our calendar, and not like as a command, but as like a, hey, this is October 31st is Reformation Day. Like, we celebrate the Reformation and what God has done in history through that specific time period. And there's nothing wrong with like saying, hey, we're going to do this holiday. I think, except for if you were to make it like a command and conscience issue to do it, right?
Yeah.
But like, I think that we're being taught to do that. like not like, what I mean? Like, Christmas is a perfect example of this. There's no command.
That's the closest thing we have to like a feast, like a week of feast.
Yeah. Yes. Christmas and Easter are the biggest ones that I could think of that the Christian church celebrates that are nowhere commanded in the Bible, and yet we're basically doing the same thing that God is telling the old covenant church to do, but we're doing it of our own will, not of a command. Right. Yeah. And so, and I think that's good. I think that those traditions are super important. Like, if God thought that was a good way to kind of like instill in his people what have I done for you, then why wouldn't it be a good thing for us to do that now?
Yeah. And it's interesting. The feast are looking back and remembering, but they're not shaming, right? They're not guilting. Like, it's meant to be a genuine like celebration,
Yes.
And I think that gets missed when you think about like the law, and you think about the feast, like, oh, they had to do this. It's like, no, this was this was a party, like in Deuteronomy, where he's like, hey, if the place that I've called you to gather is too far, sell all your goods and then take your money and then go buy whatever you want to eat and whatever you want to drink, whether it be wine or strong drink. It's like, that sounds like a really good party that you'd want to go to.
Yeah.
It's
one of the reasons why this is one of the reasons why this is like one of the few things I really don't like about the Puritans, is that the Puritans were adamantly against Christmas. It's like,
I could never be a Puritan.
Like, it's like they were the original Grinch.
In that regard, right?
In that regard, yeah, they were wonderful and joyful in so many other ways, but like they were just like didn't like the idea of a Christian feast day that was on the calendar, I guess. So. And who knows? Maybe they were living during a time when it was more like mandated and stuff, right?
Yeah, sure.
But, it's so weird to say like, "Hey, I'm against this party because I'm being told to do it." It's like, So
yes, sir.
But one of the things you talked about also is that these feasts all point towards a greater rest, right?
Yeah,
like the joy of the feast also points towards a future feast, right? A future rest. And I think that principle of they look forward is still operative even today in our current rest, in our current feasting. It's like, every time we rest and we feast, we also should remember that this feast, points forward to a future rest that has been purchased by Christ and his coming, right?
Yeah.
So I think, I talked a little bit about something like this in my sermon yesterday. I'm trying not to get like ahead of myself, but
okay.
But so, okay. One other thing about the feasting and stuff is that obviously there's a clear tie to this feasting being, there's a clear tie to worship here as well, right? Like worship is part of this. Like that's why all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowhere, it says, "And no other God's name shall be on your name on your lips," right?
Yeah.
Like
Yep.
there's a clear tie to worship with all these things, and I think that's interesting because later when you get in Leviticus, when he talks about the different feasts, he talks about the Sabbath as a feast day, and I think that probably should be in our minds when we think about what the Lord's Day is. When we worship God together, we should think of it like a celebratory feast where, and if you have some practice at the end of the church service to go home and relax and feast at home, that's a good way to commemorate that weekly worship cycle.
Yeah.
So one last, I'm realizing we're running out of time. One last thing I think we should touch on is, I know it's like we lingered on some stuff.
We need C-sides.
Is
the stuff that didn't fit into B-sides would be C-sides.
Exactly. So the last part of this section is all about commands regarding living in the land God is giving them, living in Canaan. And there's some really interesting things in this passage about how God is not going to kind of give them like a fell swoop. As soon as you go in, all the people that are there are just going to, be conquered. Like, the phrase used is little by little. Like, little by little, I'm going to give you this land. Little by little, I'm going to drive the inhabitants out. And he gives some reasons for why. Like, I think the wild beasts would overtake you or something like that. So I think it'd be kind of cool to talk. And you had mentioned this earlier when we were talking. Can you explain or maybe just hash out a little bit what's going on there? What's up with the little by little?
It reminds me of a Radiohead song. It says in verse 29, I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little, I would drive them out before you until you have increased and possess the land. So we actually talked about this in a staff meeting, like I think a year ago or something, and talking about buildings and stuff. Yeah. So basically, you have this land that's occupied by all these different people. You got the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivitites, the Jebusites, right? So that land is being occupied. And if God removes all of them from the land, right, Israel isn't in the land yet. It's going to be a while before they get into that land. And they're also not like multiplying to be as large as these people who are in the land. So if you have a city that's being run by people and all those people leave their jobs and relocate, you have a lot of jobs that nobody knows how to do. And when you don't have people living in a city, even just set aside like the technical jobs for like running things, when you just remove people who are living in a general area, that area is quickly overrun. So you see this in like post apocalyptic movies. One example would be I Am Legend, right? Or you've got, have you seen that movie? I Am Legend?
I have.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I like that movie.
It's a super interesting premise that there is like a vaccine or a cure to cancer that they apply widely, and they suppress the side effects of it, and it turns out that it turns people or some people into zombies, and so the city becomes like taken over with zombies, and so you have the National Guard and the army is removing everybody out, and I think it's like, is it New York where this happens? I think it's
I think so. Yeah,
I think it's New York.
It is New York.
And so you have this city that was like hustling and bustling and skyscrapers and all this stuff and technology and art and music. And once you remove everybody, nature just takes over and it becomes like very hostile and uninhabitable. It's kind of like There's these obscure videos on YouTube about places where there was like the World Fair or these massive celebrations or the
Yeah.
Olympics, and you'll go back and it's like the Winter Olympics, they build these bobsled facilities for them. But once the Olympics are gone and everything leaves, sometimes they're not occupied, and it's super creepy.
It's eerie, and
It's
nature takes
yes.
over.
They before Chernobyl erupted, there was like a city and a fair that was built there.
Yes.
There's like a Ferris wheel, and it was like they wanted the workers to have their own community where they'd never have to leave. And so, of course, everybody left after the meltdown. But then you go back there, and it's like there's nothing creepier than a city that has been like everybody's left. So, anyways, that was a long way of saying when God is not going to just remove everybody from the land and then wait for the time for Israel to be ready to occupy it. It's going to be little by little, incrementally. God is going to give a little land as they're ready to occupy it, and a little more as it goes. And you get this idea, and I think this is actually really, it's been really encouraging as we've been looking for the building, for our church and what's the next space. It's like, God is there are times when God uses our enemies to keep things for us until we're ready to receive them. And that's what's going on with the land. The land is being taken care of. Like the wild beasts are being kept out. Order is being maintained by a people who are opposed to Israel. But God is using those people right now to maintain that city so that when Israel gets into the land, like it isn't overrun with wild beasts and crazy vegetation, but it's a place where people can live. And so, but that process is going to happen slowly. And I think we were talking before this about it's in James Jordan's book, The Law of the Covenant, which we're telling everybody to get. I have it here again. If you haven't got it yet,
it's the best.
Get this book. It is so helpful. Okay, I think it's like what, $30 or something like that.
It's really good.
But he talks in that book about this basic principle that if you we want to see our community become Christian, right? We want to see Christians everywhere.
Yeah.
But if all of the non-Christians left Kitsap tomorrow, we'd be in a bunch of trouble, because there's all of these skills, there's all of these jobs that are being done by people who aren't Christians. And it's like right now, that is how God is sustaining this place. It's one of the ways that he keeps it in order, which then allows the church the time to preach the gospel, to make disciples, to grow and to multiply, so that gradually over time, Christians are increasingly moving in and occupying things that are being preserved for them right now by people who don't agree with us. It's a weird thought.
Totally. There's a lot of there's a lot of good principles there too for application. Like, be patient. God, something doesn't happen right away. A lot of times things happen little by little. Like we want to expect, we want to expect you put a seed in the ground and the next day you go and check on it and you're upset that it's not like bearing fruit already. Right? Like, and you end up picking at the seed and ruining it as you go and check on it. How's it doing? Right. And that's not the way God works. That's not the way he's built our human life to work. Things take time. And I think that it's oddly comforting to know, okay, I can, I really want to see that. Like if I don't see it right away, it doesn't mean that something's gone wrong. Like, what I mean? To me, that's comforting. It's like, okay, so God has his timing, and he will give us little by little what we're ready for. Yeah. And so there's a lot of comfort in that, but it also doesn't mean that like if it's looking little by little, that's not going to happen.
Right. Right.
So I find that really encouraging, comforting. And I think that's a good note to end on.
Yeah, okay.
Let you have anything else you want to add to that?
I do not. All
right.
I think
all right.
Like, be patient is what you're saying. Be patient and trust and right, you know the end game, and so you just have to live with that in mind.
Absolutely. All right, that's good. All right, everybody, thanks for joining us for Sermon B-Sides. Until next time, trust Christ, go to church, and love your neighbor. See ya.
See ya.